Good morning, everyone. My name is Padmaja Satyamurthy. I'm the Technology Director of Skoll Foundation. In this session on Illuminating Data's Dark Side, we'll hear from a great set of diverse speakers who are asking the questions and finding the answers about the power of data doing good. This session will be moderated by Alliy Courey Pryor, founding and executive director of Data2X, an organization that promotes the acceleration and use of gender data for advancing gender equality. Please feel free to read more about Alliy at Skoll.org. Have a great session, Alliy.
Great. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for that introduction. It's wonderful to be here for this panel. As we think about this conversation that we're going to have today, there are so many advantages and opportunities for acceleration that new data technologies give to us. Everything from, making grocery shopping easier to picking the perfect book to read on a long commute to many, many other social benefits, of course. But there are also several risks. Several of you in this room are aware of those risks, and I think that's why you're here at this panel this morning. There are risks in terms of the engagement of communities in developing new data technologies in the first place. There are also risks, and this is top of mind for some, in terms of the transparency of how data is used about people and what they know about how that data is being used. But we are people who like to be solution-oriented, and so the opportunity that we have is to convene a group of amazing thinkers and doers in this room and virtually to acknowledge these risks, look them in their face, in their virtual face, and do something about it as a community. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. But before we do that, I'm going to use an example of an area where there have been historical gaps, but where I think there's also a lot of promise and advancement for the future. Maybe. It should work. Technical difficulties. Well, I can just talk from this slide. So as our introducer said, I run Data2X. We are focused on gender data, and we are working with partners to both advance the understanding that people have about what gender data is, why there are gaps, to accelerate the production of gender data. We work with partners, a wide variety of partners, with UN agencies, with governments, with international institutions, to close data gaps. And we do this by not only working on those technical data gaps, but also how we derive insights from those data and how we then use that data for long-term policy change. It's not advancing. Okay. So before I talk about data sources, so data sources and where we get our data from in the first place are a big generation when we're talking about data production. This is where a lot of these issues of bias that we care very much in the gender equality space, this is where issues of bias come in. But before I talk too much about bias, let me just say a few things by what I mean about gender data. I don't want to assume that everyone's on the same page. So I mean about three different things. One is sex disaggregation. So if we're only asking primary school enrollments of children overall, but we don't ask about boys and girls, and we won't really understand what the differences are and how to address them. Second is data that pertains specifically to women due to their biology, so collecting data on something like uterine cancer rates. And then third is the idea of data being collected about women that is in some way constrained by their social roles. So this might be the way that we might view in data collection women's economic roles and how those should play out, or how we and whether we collect data on intimate partner violence. But it's not really enough to just talk about data sources, and so we really have made a concerted effort to understand the full data value chain that exists here. So anywhere from production in terms of data sources all the way through to data use. And we did this with our partner, Open Data Watch. And it's not advancing again, but I will just say that I'm going to give two examples of how we get from bias in production and addressing bias in production to more effective data use. So on the data production side, I'll give you two examples. One is on a traditional source of data, so on labor force surveys. Now it's going wild on me. So one is on labor force data. So the way that labor force surveys work is that there are certain questions, and historically there have been certain questions that have been asked a certain way. So something like, what is your primary occupation? And historically for men, this was a pretty straightforward question. For women, however, their economic lives are often more complicated and intersect with their household and their household responsibilities, whether that's childcare or work on a family farm. And so as a result, because of the way that questions were being asked, you were not getting responses that actually represented women's full economic lives. If you start to change the way and the bias and the production side of how you ask those questions, and then you use that information to derive actionable insights for policymakers, and then you then take that data and apply it to decision making at the policy level, you could end up having a pretty amazing impact long term in terms of women's economic production. There's also various examples that I could give on the big data side that I won't due to time. We're doing a lot of work on this issue on addressing big data for gender. There's lots of projects that I would love to tell you all about. But just in closing, I would say that we as a global community, and I'm sure a lot of you have been following the work on the Sustainable Development Goals, we all agreed on 17 different goals that we wanted to do to protect planet and people and to promote prosperity. Within those goals, gender equality and women's empowerment is absolutely paramount. The world statisticians agreed on 53 indicators to track whether or not we are achieving progress on gender equality. We have a baseline for 10. So our work is cut out for us, but the good news is that we have great people doing great partnership work. I hope that all of you will join us, so let's roll up our sleeves and hitch up our skirts. And now I'm going to turn to our wonderful panel to illuminate even more opportunities for data in the future. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Ramesh Srinivasan from UCLA. Thanks.
They gave me a replacement. Oh, okay. Sorry. Hello, everybody. How are you this morning? I'm very happy to be here. I just want to, okay, great. This looks like this is working. Let me just mention a couple things. First of all, I'm extremely honored to be here at the Skoll World Forum. I had been following this forum for some years, so I was very honored to be invited to share some of my research in the context of this panel. Also, you can interact with me via Twitter, which is something I'm trying to use more often. And my handle is there up on the page itself. All right, fantastic. So these are very, very timely issues that we're engaging with here. Of course, many of us woke up this morning reading the testimony that Mark Zuckerberg gave to the Senate. And some of us were watching it hours long. And I want to sort of talk about a few parameters of the problem and try to think about this theme of our forum around proximity and think about that as sort of a mechanism of working past some of these problems that we see in terms of the disconnections between models of collection, aggregation, calculation, and therefore responsiveness around data and people themselves, right? So this is one of many stories that have made the rounds, written by journalists that are friends of mine. And this is a story that ProPublica published that for approximately $30, using Facebook as a micro-targeting platform, about 2,300 to be exact, people were identified on the Facebook platform that were identified as being Jew haters, neo-Nazis, and so on. So the question here is not necessarily the fact that people might identify as such, but what are the bases, algorithmically and in a back-end data-based sense, by which people might be identified as such, and how for such a low number, such a small amount of investment, you could access and target people based on these sorts of categories that they themselves might not fully identify with, and as a result, they might become those categories themselves. So these are common issues, and this is a question of micro-targeting that can occur through data models that are built about people, that platforms, such as Facebook and Analytica as an example, are symptoms of a larger architecture that doesn't have necessarily reciprocity, communicativeness, transparency, and accountability around personal data, around user data. So this is not simply an issue of micro-targeting using data-oriented platforms, but it's also a question of algorithmic visibility. Increasingly, we all know that that which we see online counts for us as what is knowledge, right? So I talk to my students about this all the time. Generally speaking, 70% of the time we click on one of the first 3 results we see on a Google search. 95% of the time we don't get to page 2. And this is a question not simply of ordering, but of filtering of information. So then the question is what are the human values for which algorithms produce the visibility and therefore the construction of what counts as knowledge? And how does that shake and impact our lives personally, but also the institutions, and more importantly, the democracies within which we aspire to live? And so if that which is popularized is that which produces more attention and therefore more engagement on a platform, which is essentially what these platforms are monetized for, and the underlying, as Tim O'Reilly puts it, master algorithm is one of capital valuation, then we can see how misinformation, and specifically targeted disinformation, can actually be the secret sauce that produces great amounts of meaning for these platforms themselves. So this, of course, is a well-known story, a story that involves groups like Cambridge Analytica, of which, again, I want to argue are symptoms of a larger issue. Cambridge Analytica spent approximately $1 million. We're able to access at least 50 million accounts through a range of different mechanisms that we've read about. But we also know, in the case of the Russians, and in the case of that we saw about $46,000 being spent, 0.5% on social media and digital kinds of micro-targeting and misinformation that represented such a small amount compared to what the Trump and Clinton campaigns spent on the very issue itself. So the key here is not necessarily the extraction of data and the monetization of data and the manipulation of data to present a worldview that might actually steer us in particular directions and shake us personally and politically and so on. But it's also the ability to use such data models in psychometric matters. So this is the ocean model. Feel free to take a look into this. But what is very interesting here is that I would be identified not just as a 40-year-old professor, but as a 40-year-old professor who's neurotic in particular manners and open in other manners. So there's a potential to reach someone in a much more subtle manner using data models that are produced about oneself that can then impact one's personal behavior. And this is part of what was being used by Analytica. It's unclear whether this was effective necessarily, but to me it represents a very personal and therefore political transgression into our lives and into our democracies. So these are symptoms of a larger problem, which I want to speak about. Oh, I'm sorry. This is actually Michal Kosinski's research, which ended up influencing the ocean model, which was then used by Analytica in various manners. So Michal is one of my informants in a book I'm writing about these very topics. So this is the title of one of my earlier books. And in this book, Whose Global Village, I'm trying to consider not just Western citizens and those of us who live in democracies or representative democracies, but the people more largely of our world. And what I believe is we can interpret this idea of proximity in relation to our data, not in a spatial sense, but in terms of our control, our awareness, our visibility, our literacy, and our power over the data that are being collected about us and how those data are being computed and engaged with to influence what we see and how we see it. So in that sense, I ask us to think about those that are emerging users of the internet, the peoples of the global south, the peoples of diverse cultures and countries. And so I talk about this in this book around this idea of ontology, which is basically a term that represents how different people see the world, how different people of diverse cultures organize the world, think about the world. And accordingly, we might think about data in somewhat similar manners. We might think about questions of what kinds of data we, in our diverse contexts, choose to make public, choose to circulate, and in what manners. So I ask us to think about tools and systems that can influence the circulation and production of data in ways that are not just human-centered, but also culture-centered, considering that the vast majority of new users of the internet more largely and mobile devices are coming from cultures that are not part of these apparatuses of data collection and monetization. So these are some models of ontology that I describe in my work that I can elaborate on further. This is a lightning talk session, so I'll just wrap up very quickly. And this is an example, which I just describe in chapter 4 of my book, where I see a group of Native Americans looking at their collective data that are being recorded about them, but instead of one person for a computer, or one person per interface, or one person per system, they are collectively looking at that data. And I think that's just an important reminder that these data issues are not just about us individually as seemingly atomized users, but they're also about our communities and the ethics and norms and cultural values that we share and believe in. And this is something I'd like to elaborate on further. So there are various pieces of software. One is called Mukuru, that actually allows various user communities to build their own sorts of digital networks and organize how they choose to circulate, transmit, and classify data. So we're, of course, at an impasse right now. We have master infrastructures that are attractive to us, that have aggregated so much attention. They have network effects that are producing so much value for these companies, but also for us as users as we can explore the larger world. But there's also a possibility for us as users, and this is what I demand, to actually figure out ways to exert our own values, our own belief systems, our own ethical principles in relation to these companies. What we have is a disconnection right now. Those that are connecting us all are actually disconnected in many ways from the users and political kinds of considerations that users face. So what we need is more engagement, more inclusivity, and we have to take it from there. So I'm going to talk about this, I hope, with some questions that you're going to ask me. So that's it for me. Thank you. I did that lightning style, I hope.
No, it was very lightning. It was great. So I'm gonna pick up where you left off, which is to ask. You said something that I found very compelling, which was the idea of the very people who are supposed to be connecting us are somehow disconnected from the process. And you talked about needing to put tools and systems in place. And I know you started to talk about one, but I would love to hear a bit more, kind of practically speaking, how does that work based on where people are creating these new tools and the communities where those new tools are being created in the first place are not in the communities where you're working. How do we actually practically facilitate that?
Yeah, it's a very challenging question. I mean, part of the issue is that as people across the world, in their own embedded systems of culture and politics, turn to larger scale platforms that are governed and implemented and designed from afar, the biases and ways of thinking about data and monetizing data and collecting data are going to be exported onto those people, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't think, of course, the solution is simply these kinds of localized systems, proximity-based systems, if you will, that I was starting to allude to at the end of the lightning talk. I could talk about that for hours. But I think we have a moment of inflection right now. We have a moment of opportunity. And it's not really about Facebook either, and it's not about Analytica. It's the underlying architecture and the absence of transparency and accountability upon which personal data rests. So as we think about this moment, this opportunity we face, where there's a great amount of public and media scrutiny on these systems and the ways they're governed or not, we have the possibility of asking for, unlike a lot of the questions being asked by our senators, asking for Mark Zuckerberg, asking for those who are building these systems to say, hey, we want to give you some opportunity to do some kind of localized proximity-based governance of your data, right? And we are vouching that we will use that local data in these ways and not these other ways. So the question is really one of communication. So, as a former engineer, and a lot of you in this room are, we often think about that which we build as kind of internally optimized, right? Like, I built this algorithm, I want to make it quicker. But what purposes it serves is something that we can't always predict. That's why we need more heterogeneous groupings where folks who understand humanity, understand society, understand culture are part of the design room and are part of the process moving forward. It's not just build it and maybe it breaks and then we deal with it. It's an iterative, communicative process that we need to engage in.
Great. Thank you for that. So much we could be, thank you. So much more we could get into. Wait, but don't leave yet.
Okay.
Don't go yet. We haven't had an opportunity for our audience. So I'm just going to open it up to at least one question, hopefully. We have about 3 minutes from the audience. Yes, right over here.
How can we govern these systems? What are the political entities that can do that?
I think it can start, there's a couple issues here. One is sort of the possibility of using tools that allow individuals themselves to sort of be able to regulate what kinds of data are or are not being accessed and engaged with themselves. So they're individualized, oriented types of tools. But I also think that there are mechanisms, just like basically Facebook, take for example, is an architecture that's designed for not openness in terms of transparency and accountability, but openness in terms of building and layering various applications on top of Facebook, right? What they call bad actor, third-party applications. Candy Crush Saga. I get invited to join Candy Crush Saga every day, right? So let's think about, instead of thinking about third-party applications that can then pull data from you, let's think about third-party applications can then live on top of platforms that allow those who collectively use those applications to actually do that those forms of governance. So I don't think, so my point being is that any community, could be a place-based community, could be an online community, could be a community of interest, should be able to use some sort of layered application on top of these platforms by which they can actually manage and govern what is flowing where and to whom. And that is sort of that's the model that I think we need to work with. We need modular models that can then be applied to community-based forms of governance. I'm not saying we're going to all reject Facebook. I find that to be kind of a naive approach, but we need ways to insert our own governance on top of these platforms.
Thank you so much. So thank you for those remarks. Really appreciate it. So our next speaker today is Megan Price, who is Executive Director of the Human Rights Data Analysis Group. So over to you.
Well, good morning. I'm very excited to be here. I'm very excited to mostly have my voice back today. And as Emily mentioned, my name is Megan Price, and I am the Executive Director of the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, or HRDAG. And we are a team of scientists who work essentially as statisticians for human rights. We partner with other human rights advocacy organizations to identify questions that can be answered or arguments that can be strengthened through quantitative analysis. And through that work, we've learned to think very hard about what's included and, just as important, what's not included in the data we rely on for those analyses. And specifically, we worry a lot about the impact that untold stories are having on the substantive conclusions we're trying to draw from our analyses. And so it's through that lens that I think about machine learning models, or if you prefer, predictive algorithms, or I suppose if I have to, artificial intelligence. But I'm today going to call them machine learning models or just models. Because those models also rely on data as inputs. And that data is inevitably incomplete and imperfect. And so we need to worry about what impact is that having on the predictions that ultimately come out of those models and the decisions and the actions we might be taking based on those predictions. And so this morning, I'm going to give you very briefly 2 examples, and I'm going to argue one ultimately harms human rights and one ultimately has the potential to help. And so I'll start with work conducted by my colleagues Christian Lum and William Isaac. And what you're looking at on the left is an estimate of drug use in the city of Oakland. And as you can see, drug use happens kind of everywhere based on a national survey. And on the right is information observed and recorded by the Oakland police about drug crimes. And this is data that was collected and organized by OpenOakland.org. And as you can see on the right, the observed and recorded data about drug crimes are in very specific neighborhoods and locations and are a very small subset of the overall drug use that we think is likely happening in Oakland. And yet, it's this small subset on the right that is typically the input to a predictive policing model. And what Christian and William are able to show very rigorously is that the result of that is that the impact of those predictive policing models that inform police forces and the strategies that they use in allocating their resources disproportionately affect historically over-policed populations. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about whether predictive policing algorithms specifically, or more generally algorithms being used within the US criminal justice system, are fair. And it turns out that fair is actually kind of hard, not hard to define, but there are multiple different ways to define it, both in words and in math. And which definition you use determines the kind of test that you're going to use to evaluate these algorithms. That's way more than I have time to cover this morning, but I wanted to point you to these two excellent resources that really dig into and describe in great detail the complexities of evaluating whether or not an algorithm is fair. I want to move now to my second example. This is work done by my colleague Patrick Ball and partners in Mexico, Data Civica, and the Human Rights Program at Universidad Iberoamericana. And what they've done is they've built a machine learning model to predict the location of hidden graves in Mexico. Now, these are graves that are discovered from time to time across the country, and our partners used newspaper clippings to identify counties where these graves had already been discovered. And then they also used their contextual knowledge to identify counties where they're fairly certain these graves probably don't exist. Now, that's very tricky because the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But based on their contextual knowledge, they're fairly sure. So we have this subset of counties that have been labeled as containing a grave and not containing a grave. And then we built a machine learning model to predict for the unlabeled counties the probability that they probably also contain one of these hidden or clandestine graves. And when we showed the results of this model to our partners, this is the highest probability counties, they weren't really surprised. They said, of course, this is where the violence is occurring in Mexico. And so what was interesting in this project was not that the model necessarily had something new to tell us. It was that it offered a new advocacy tool to the groups that are representing the families of the victims so that they could petition the state and say, look, it's not just us calling for these investigations. There's science and there's technology backing us up. And so we're just in the early stages of seeing how they can use this as an advocacy tool. But the point that I want to make this morning is that both of these examples use very similar modeling technology, and they both rely on incomplete and imperfect data. And yet, I would argue that in the case of predicting missing graves in Mexico, we have the potential to do good. And when this model fails to identify a certain kind of grave, what we have done is we have missed an opportunity to do good. Whereas with predictive policing algorithms, what we're doing at best is replicating the bias that's already present in our policing system. And at worst, depending upon how they're being used, we're exacerbating and enhancing that bias, and we're hiding it behind an algorithm that seems objective. And I just want to close by saying that this is nothing new. In 1897, criminologists were saying that police data is so partial and so selective that we can't use it to draw conclusions about patterns of crime. Also in the early 1900s, most of the statistical profession was arguing over how to sample data and how to draw conclusions about samples of data. But they reached consensus. And they have ideas now about what to do with missing data and how to adjust for bias. Now, they were worried about inference, which is slightly different from prediction. But the lessons still apply. And so I want to use this week's theme of drawing power from proximity, and I want to call for all of us to do more interdisciplinary work. It's not possible for us to know about all the different work that's being done in different fields. So let's draw our colleagues closer. Let's talk about our problems, and let's listen in case their fields have some insight to offer to the things we're struggling with. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Megan. We have a lot to talk about. So I actually want to pick up on, it's sort of related to the question that the woman over here asked of Ramesh, which is to get quite practical. So, you've given a great example of a dangerous case in terms of predictive policing, but also a positive use case in terms of the example you gave from Mexico. And so, what I'm really interested in is understanding what an ethics of algorithm development could actually look like. And, perhaps you could provide a small set of core principles as we all go forth and find ways to be working together and better collaborating. What is that kind of core set of principles that we could be using?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to cheat a little bit, and instead of offering a core set of principles, I'm going to point to the other folks who are working on this, because the good news is that a lot of people are asking that question now. And everything from data science classes at universities are now incorporating issues of ethics, to organizations like the Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency in Machine Learning and in other fields now are putting forth really deep thinking about ethics. In the US, DJ Patel is struggling with this, and AI Now is putting out a lot of AI impact papers, really thinking through all of these issues. So the one thing that I want to say, though, and just to be absolutely clear, I'm definitely pro-ethics, and I think it's good that we're thinking about these things. But
I'm glad we got that out of the way.
But in keeping with the theme of this session, I think it's also important to think about some potential unintended consequences. Mm-hmm. And I think about this from the perspective of at universities' institutional review boards, which I also think are in general a good idea, but often get used to stifle research. And in particular, the thing that I worry about is that researchers at universities have to fulfill institutional review board responsibilities, but researchers at other institutions sometimes do not. It depends on sort of where that research is being conducted. So if we think about, if we create something like an IRB for algorithms, well, is Facebook going to be beholden to that? Is the local police force going to be? So I want us to think really big about how are we not only going to develop a set of guidelines and a set of ethics, but how are we actually going to apply that evenly to all of the different areas that are going to be using this technology.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, that is a lot of food for thought. So with that, let's open it up to the audience for a question. I don't know who raised first. I think she did. Are you in the white shirt? Sorry. Thanks. We'll talk after.
It's okay, I'm around.
Are you sure? Okay. Thanks for that. My name is Noura. I work with the MasterCard Foundation. And we're interested in the kinds of algorithms that essentially decide on access with regards, be it financial services or potentially hiring decisions, et cetera. So I'm curious I'm curious whether you actually got your hands on the police algorithm that you studied and how that went, how they gave access to, or whether it was already open. And B, if you're doing any work or you know of any work on the types of algorithms on financial inclusion and also hiring, firing, et cetera. Because there's a lot of bias in that as well, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So the specific policing algorithm that we used was Predpol. They did not grant us access to it, but they are the only, that I'm aware of, they are the only group that is published in a peer-reviewed journal about their work. And so there was enough information in that journal for Christiane and William to back calculate what the algorithm was. So they sorted it out that way. As far as your other question, not yet. So far, we've only looked at policing and criminal justice more broadly. But wow, those financial decisions and hiring and firing are fascinating and need to be dug into.
Agreed. So thank you so much, Megan,
thank you.
for your talk. And, can you give it to Mbwana, please? Thank you. Oh, and he doesn't have slides. Oh, this is beautiful. So pass it on to, well, we'll figure that out afterwards. So very pleased to introduce Mbwana Alliy, who is founder and managing partner of the Savannah Fund.
Good morning, everyone. So I don't have any slides. I'll spare you any details. I just couldn't prepare them. It's such a complex topic for what I do in Africa to put in a 7-minute presentation, and I just couldn't do it. So I thought I'd just talk about my work and how data and basically influences the work I do. So my background is I'm Tanzanian, and I've lived in the UK for 11 years and the US for 9 years. So I spent time in aerospace in the UK, actually quite near Salisbury. So which is turning on the TV and seeing on the news where I used to live, being like a subject of this, chemical scandal is really, really interesting. I then spent time in the US, went to business school at Stanford, and then actually my first kind of foray into data, I would say, started when I was in the aerospace industry, building modeling simulations for sort of military flight tests. But then I also worked in data as a product manager for Excel and Access and Business Intelligence at Microsoft after Stanford. So, Excel being one of the most widely used, data tools, but also I worked in the business intelligence group at the time when Microsoft was kind of building out their business intelligence practice. So that's kind of my background in data. I then moved back to California 2007, 8, and started working in venture capital. And one day I was told that I probably won't be, the Silicon Valley's next big venture capitalist, but I probably could go back to Tanzania or back to Africa and start doing venture capital there, because there's nothing going on there. And so in 2010, 11, I started making moves towards doing this, and had a first fund launched in 2011, 12. And we've invested in 26 startups in 6 countries since 2012 out of our first fund, and now we're in our second fund, which is going to expand that work. So one of the reasons I was able to actually raise the fund to begin with is because of actually data. Question is, if you're going to invest in startups in Africa, where would you start looking initially? And actually the answer came from Kenya with M-Pesa. Started to see a lot of information about financial inclusion in Kenya as to what M-Pesa was doing to open sort of banking services across the country. I think as of today, something like a third or more of the transactions flow through M-Pesa. So a third of the GDP of Kenya flows through M-Pesa. So it's become the national switch. And of course, I'm sure you all know what M-Pesa is. Some people say that it's now overhyped, but it's now effectively about 12-year technology that basically upended the entire financial scene in East Africa now, because Tanzania obviously has M-Pesa and other mobile money services like Airtel Money, Tigo Pesa. But the interesting thing here is that there was no real API to begin with M-Pesa. So Safaricom and Vodacom in Tanzania and others weren't really releasing that data for other service providers in the beginning. So in the first 5 or 6 years of M-Pesa's growth, it was pretty siloed, the data. And so things were pretty good, I would say. But I would say in the last 3 or 4 years, you started seeing the data being used by other companies, building on top of mobile money. So right now in Kenya, and also in a little bit in Nigeria, but also Tanzania, you're seeing the rise of these fintech lending companies that basically have started to build sort of algorithms and using the data directly from the phone, not even using the API. So just because you don't have an API doesn't mean you can't get the data. Because when you do a transaction, it still lives on your phone. So a lot of these fintech lenders like Branch or Tala, they will actually allow a user, basically using permission settings in Android, which of course is the #1 smartphone platform in Africa, which obviously has quite flexible permission settings compared to, say, iOS. I think iOS is becoming more locked down as far as data and making a bit more aware about how the data can be used. But imagine a Kenyan farmer often getting a smartphone for the first time, going from a feature phone, having used M-Pesa, and then going to a smartphone. And they just accept all the permissions. And some of these apps will read their SMSs, read all their M-Pesa receipts, which are basically as SMSs. They'll also connect to Facebook, surprise, surprise, and read all their friends. And then from there, start to create algorithms that predict basically, creditworthiness. And so you've seen some of these companies become quite large, Branch and Tala being the biggest in East Africa. But actually, there is a little bit of a barrier for scaling beyond Kenya. So where I'm from, Tanzania, there actually isn't national ID. And if you don't have a national ID, you obviously open up potential for fraud. And so extending out into places like Uganda, DRC, Tanzania has become more difficult because of the fact that there's no national ID to act as like a sort of important pillar as far as access to credit. We've invested in only one data lender in Nigeria. That's actually more on a small business, we actually think that there might be a crash coming in the fintech lending space in Kenya, kind of similar to what happened in microfinance, prior. I'm starting to see, like, if you go into an Uber in Nairobi, you can easily see someone, an Uber driver, with using their smartphone as for the Uber app, but also having like 3 or 4 fintech lending companies on that platform paying off for fuel, et cetera, because Uber actually pays quite late, pays that drivers quite late. And so actually, if you're ever in Kenya and using Uber, please use cash, because Uber pays really late as far as for the drivers, so they have to borrow, and they're often taking multiple loans to do this. And there's no centralized bureau yet, so that's a really big problem. So that's kind of a little bit of insight as to what I do and how data is kind of really important to my work in Africa. I guess,
Thank you so much, Mbwana, for that. And also, thanks for the tip on Uber payment in Africa. That's good to know. I'm going to file that away. So one of the things I'm really curious, and I think you would have such a unique perspective on, is a theme that came up kind of at the top of the talk, and we've heard from Ramesh and Megan as well, which is that one of the dark sides of data is the inclusion of different communities in terms of how technologies are developed. Savannah Fund is investing in entrepreneurs and in data technologists. So I'm just curious, from your perspective, what is either the quickest or the smartest, I know they're not always the same thing, way to really ramp up data scientists in Africa to build a better data future?
This is an important question, because most of the best data scientists and all the algorithms have been developed outside, as we've been hearing. Safaricom only recently asked me, which is the mobile operator that runs the mobile money in Kenya, like, do you know anyone who can help us in AI? Just as a question. And I was like, well, we need to talk like much broader, because they realize that all these fintech lenders they're coming to use that data, and if they're not going to give it to them, they'll find it other ways, right? And so one of the bright lights here is probably the coding schools that are starting to pop up in Africa. So I don't know if you've heard of Andela. Zuckerberg actually invested in that, as well as Gates and others. And so they started in Nigeria, and they're actually developing coding skills for Africans to basically start building these themselves. And they've also opened in Nairobi now. So one of my rockstar interns, Audrey, she opened up a coding school, Moringa School, in Nairobi. And so you're starting to see a lot of these new schools coming in, trying to plug that gap. And they often talk to the companies and try and figure out what are the gaps. And so if they go to Safaricom, they'll find out that, wait a minute, big data, obviously data, machine learning, and algorithms are actually a big important part. Yeah. So I think that's probably the biggest bright light. It's probably both the smartest and the fastest. The other, if you want to go fast, I guess you could do what I did, which is leave the country and go study abroad and learn from great institutes like Oxford, Stanford, etc. But in South Africa, there's also good universities. In fact, some of the smartest engineers I've met in Africa are definitely in South Africa. And of course, they accept students from all over Africa. And so I think that's probably the best. And just of course internships and if Safaricom partnered with Vodafone, because they're a shareholder, they could send Kenyans and Tanzanians up to those places. The other thing is also China. We're seeing a lot more. We're seeing folks like Alibaba, Tencent coming in, and they're also saying Jack Ma has actually created like. He visited, I think, last year, and he actually flew back something like 30 or 40 entrepreneurs from Kenya to go and learn about how Alibaba does e-commerce, and of course, with that, they'll learn data skills as part of that. Yeah.
Well, it's great to hear that there's such interest in the topic, and also really great that there's a fund like yours established there and working directly with entrepreneurs. So let me turn it over to the audience for any questions. Yes, Fred.
Hi, I'm Frederic. I'm working with Dalberg on big data. So what we see in Africa is that in many cases we lack data on a large portion of the population. And so basically what it means, and for many reasons, just these people are not connected at all. And so what it means is that all the insights that we're going to derive are going to be super and highly biased in a way or another. How do you see the creation of and the setup of such a data ecosystem in Africa, and more broadly, by the way, which is less biased than it used to be until now?
So it's interesting, when you think about the biggest companies or platforms in the West that have a lot of data, Google, Facebook come to mind, even government, right? I would say in my home country of Tanzania, I would not underestimate the power of the government there now. starting to get smarter on this. In fact, Tanzania just released a data and social media law, by complete coincidence, coming into this week where Zuckerberg is testifying. But, and also they're now ramping up national ID. They're getting smarter. Also, China's probably helping a lot here to build infrastructure. So I'd look at that. And then other companies that I would look at is, for example, the solar pay-as-you-go companies. They could be really good new platforms. Facebook is still there, and by the way, don't underestimate Facebook because they actually do free basics in Africa and many countries where there's lack of connectivity. So, so without connectivity, you can't get data very easily. But free basics is basically reverse billing or free Facebook in exchange for something. Question is, what is that? Right, and it's basically data. And so Facebook is probably we know that it's the internet for many people in the West, but it's even more than the only internet. It's a closed garden. So I look at them, but I'm very intrigued by the solar companies because they're connecting the unconnected and lack of energy. If you don't have any energy, no solar charging for your phone, you're not going to be visible. And so companies like Mcopa, Off-Grid Electric, one of the award winners actually, Angaza Leslie, I don't know if she's here, but she's building a great company around pay-as-you-go, which that data can then be used to infer. It's like the most basic thing you can ask a human to give you data is what do you use every day for your energy, right? Then from there you can add because those companies are adding TV, solar-powered TVs, they're adding other appliances and building up from there. So I think those companies have high valuations right now, often because they're connecting the unconnected and they could potentially be this source of data.
That's great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Mbwana, for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk.
Yes.
I just feel so bad. I'm just rushing everybody through these answers. But now I'm very pleased to introduce Doug Galen, who is not only a lecturer at the Stanford School of Business, but also the CEO of RippleWorks. Come to the stage.
Good morning, everybody. Blockchain in 7 minutes. Here we go. So before we can even understand whether blockchain is evil, good, what are the implications, what is it, and how is it being used? And so we're going to spend a few minutes talking about that. In both my roles at Stanford and at RippleWorks, I care deeply about what is going to empower and help social entrepreneurs to achieve their mission. There is no more hyped platform right now than blockchain. And so what we wanted to do was understand what is reality and what is hype. And so first of all, in terms of hype, Long Island iced tea. Has anyone heard about Long Island iced tea? They decided to change the name to Long Island Blockchain. Guess what? Stock price went up 400%. True story. I cannot make this up. That's the hype. But the promise. So in terms of coffee makers, smallholder farmers represent 80% of the coffee made in this world. They average $2 a day in income. Bext 360 out of Denver, Colorado has created a way to use blockchain to be able to pay farmers quicker, which means kids can stay in school, they can get fed, as well as monitor the entire value chain so that the price at the end can actually come back to the farmer. That's reality. So what we wanted to, before we can really talk about even the reality, there's a basic fundamental of blockchain. Now, I'm going to take on the death-defying act tomorrow of explaining blockchain in 47 seconds, but that's tomorrow at breakfast. If we only take one thing, it is that cryptocurrency does not equal blockchain. We think of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is this thing called cryptocurrency. There's 1,500 cryptocurrencies in the world now. That's interesting, that's fascinating, that's a currency. I use the iceberg here because that's what we all see. Underneath the water is the blockchain. And the blockchain is a technology platform that is fascinating. There are 4 big promises of blockchain. If you want to take blockchain down to what matters and what would be interesting to you, the first is transparency. An example of transparency, today $143 billion in aid is sent around the world. 30% of it is lost because of corruption or fraud. What if 100% could get to the end user? Blockchain has transparency so that you know where it goes. Immutability, that is a really fancy word for tamper-proof. So voting, as an example, we all know what's going on in terms of fraud, in corruption of voting. We also know physical safety as it relates to voting. What if you could vote? There's organizations now, Modem, Votum has created a way to actually vote using blockchain. Lower cost payments, $500 billion sent in remittances around the world. The promise of blockchain, which has been proven, is that you can reduce the cost to near zero. Disperse is actually funding money into Swaziland and eliminated 98% of the cost to be able to move money around the world. And the last is identity. Interestingly enough, in this country, in the developed world, we talk a lot about limiting our identity, making it smaller, getting rid of the identity. Well, you know what? There's 2 billion people who are unbanked in the world. They want an identity. They want to get access to money, and banks will never admit them into their banking system. So how do we help? These are the promises of blockchain. So here's what I wanted to do. This is the promise. I wanted to understand the reality. And so with a team of researchers at Stanford, we dug into 193 initiatives, blockchain initiatives, and we had 2 questions. One, what is the state of blockchain in terms of blockchain for good? What industries are being used? What are the use cases? And then second, we wanted to form an opinion of, is it reality or is it hype? Full report, it's coming out tomorrow. I'll show you a URL at the end where you can go. And then there's a breakfast tomorrow as well if you want to hear about it. So here's a couple of things that we learned. First of all, the leading sector. We expected the leading sector of blockchain to be financial inclusion. Interestingly enough, 2 times higher were health-related activities in terms of how blockchain could assist in the health industry. Really was around record keeping, around tracking drugs to make sure that they're being stored properly, and counterfeit drugs. 700,000 people a year die from counterfeit drugs just in malaria and polio alone. You can see the other major categories right here: financial inclusion, philanthropy, democracy, energy, agriculture. We then wanted to look at what are the primary use cases, and records and verification and payments were the top, no big surprise. But you can see the other categories as well. Now we wanted to go to hype. So we asked a couple of questions. The first was, okay, blockchain, is it transformative to what you're doing? Is it materially better than what you're doing? Or nah, you're just Long Island iced tea using the name. And we were interested to see that 86% of the blockchain initiatives that we identified and studied were either materially better or completely transformational and revolutionary. There was 14% that fell into the hype category. The other that we looked at to understand is impact close or not? And this surprised us. 55% are going to have impact on individuals in the next year. Conversely, 74% of every organization we studied are either in pilot or concept stage, but we were intrigued to see that impact is a little closer than we had thought. So I talked about the 4 areas. The thought is, if you're thinking about using blockchain in any way, the need that you should be trying to solve is around transparency, immutability, and lower cost payments and identity. Lastly, I just will reference here is that if this is of interest to you and you want to dig in, we're going to dig into this in a big way tomorrow morning at Oxford Town Hall. If you're interested in attending, you can either show up, but better yet, send me an email so that we can get you on the list. That's Doug@RippleWorks.org. Doug@RippleWorks.org if you want to go to this breakfast, and we'll be publishing the report later today or tomorrow morning. Okay.
Thank you. You ran the gauntlet and succeeded in 7 minutes. So wanted to ask you, one of the key issues that we who work in the data world have is the issue of translation. So, whether you're a statistician trying to explain what your findings mean to a ministry official, or you are, in your case, trying to use an iceberg to describe a very complicated subject of blockchain to this community. So how, and in the case of blockchain, which can be confusing even to technologists, how do you take that technology and work with that and get input of non-technologists, especially in some of the communities that you're trying to engage? How do you do that? What kind of examples have you seen of where that translation is working effectively for mutual benefit?
The best translation in the real world is when you never see blockchain. It's a technology that is hidden behind what's being done. So there's an organization in the Philippines called Coins.ph. Coins.ph does remittance payments. They use blockchain to actually move the money. The user never sees the blockchain. So one of the key things here is to understand it's people first, technology second. Solve the need of the person, and then the technology, in theory, you should be agnostic to what the technology is. Most of us don't care about the technology that powers the iPhone or the Android.
That's true. So it's like a beneficent iceberg.
It's a let's go with that.
Great. So now let's open it up to the audience. I saw your hand first.
A lot of those examples around identity, like Estonia has been doing e-government identity for years without blockchain. We see mobile money without blockchain. How much is it really adding value?
So we are seeing in many cases, Estonia being one, there's 1,000 different departments in Estonia using Estonia. 1,700 different services are on top of that platform. These are really valuable services that could be ported to the rest of the world. If the governments can start to use blockchain, the poor do not have time to go to government offices. They don't have time to go to banks to collect money. So the potential is meaningful, and there are numerous examples. I just highlighted a few, and I don't know how I can do it here in this room, where they are actually doing some of the things I talked about. Disperse would be one, and I could go on.
Yeah, I guess what I'm asking is that Estonia had the expert architecture and using digital identity long before blockchain was in use. So, like...
Yeah. So where's blockchain fit into this? So great. So yes, and blockchain is the next iteration. So the ability to move money anywhere around the world right now, that was never possible. Even if we think we're using Venmo or PayPal, it's still going through a bank. So that was not something that was possible till today. That is a fundamental use. Digital identity would be another fundamental use. So they are happening. I just can't go through them all. It is in the report. We have 16 different case studies.
All right, unfortunately, we have to wrap. I know there were more questions on this topic. I'm sorry, but you know what? He's having a breakfast tomorrow morning. Doug at RippleWorks. So you should come to that. Thanks, Doug. Okay, and last but certainly not least, we have Brett Gaylor, who's commissioning editor of the Mozilla Foundation. So take it away. Thanks.
Hi. So I'm a filmmaker, and I make films about the internet. This poster is from one I made called RIP, a Remix Manifesto, which really looked at how the internet was transforming copyright law and how we thought of intellectual property. I also made one called Do Not Track, which was actually an interactive documentary series that collected data about you while you were watching the film. That won a Peabody Award for really helping people understand what information they were sharing online. My day job is I work for the Mozilla Foundation. We're the nonprofit behind Firefox. And I support other media makers like myself who are examining the health of the internet. But I wanted to talk to you about a film that I made last year with my son, Rowan. So can I just get a quick show of hands? Who here uses an iPhone? And what about Android? Okay, so more of you may be familiar with Siri than are familiar with the Google Assistant, which I use. And if you use that, like my son, who loves it, you might have asked it all kinds of questions. My son asks it, like, where is Texas? What are Lego Ninjas? We used to play with it all the time together. And one day I happened to be browsing my Google settings, and I noticed this thing on the right, which is basically a log of every single request that he or I had made of the Google Assistant, which I could play back as an audio file. So I decided to make a film with that material, and I want to show it to you.
Navigate to 4955 Highgate Road.
I started using voice commands about a year ago on my phone. I'd use the voice feature to try and find any of the stuff I'd normally Google.
What is the weather in San Francisco?
It's 14 degrees and partly cloudy in San Francisco.
What is a warlock?
Sure, pictures of a warlock.
What is the world's longest burp?
My family started using it too.
Google now, what is my belly button?
Is wood ash good for all rooting plants?
but no one in the family used it more than my 5-year-old son, Rowan.
What is an iPad?
It's Googling it. Rowan, what are other things you don't know that you don't know about? These are all different ways that you can use the Google thing.
Oh.
How do you say computer in French?
What is stupid in French?
Stupide.
Then I realized that a year of these searches had actually been saved on Google's servers. I could play back everything he'd searched for on the device.
What is blue? What is naked? What is inappropriate?
All right.
What's triangle?
Triangle, a plane figure with 3 straight sides and 3 angles.
Shaman.
There you go. Pictures of a shaman.
What is shaman?
As the year progressed, I noticed the two of them beginning to bond.
What are blue jellyfish? What is Mexico? What is dancing? What is gymnastics? What is flying? What is a bee? What is a lollipop? What is trick-or-treating? What are ninjas?
Google has been with Rowan from the start, and I get the feeling this is a lifelong relationship. Even though I know them both intimately, I can't imagine what it'll be like when they grow up. But Rowan is already asking the right questions.
What is everything?
Everything, all things, all the things of
Google
a
is
group or
launching
class.
a company that
Machine
hopes to
learning is
cure
a type
death.
of
It
artificial
used to be called
intelligence that
background.
allows
Software
software
application
applications trying to run away technological growth, resulting in unfathomable changes to human civilization.
Google now, Google now, Google now, now.
Thank you. So most people ask me when they watch that, so like, is he still allowed to use the phone? But behind their eyes, and I'm sort of seeing some of it here, the question is this guy a terrible parent? So let's actually look at what does Google do with this data? And the answer is we don't really know, but there's some things that we do know, what's going on in these data centers. And the first is that it's used to improve search. Simple search. It turns out that what we speak gets at what we're looking for much better than what we type. So those voices are used to train the algorithm of search. And it's the same with translation. Those voice searches have radically improved the Google Translate engine, the natural language processors that improve it. But then there's DeepMind, which is the leading artificial intelligence platform that Google acquired. You might be familiar with DeepMind as the technology that powers AlphaGo. I'm getting a lot of nods. DeepMind is powerful because it uses machine learning, so it can examine large data sets and then learn on its own the best way to solve a problem. And Google obviously has vast data sets that we give it, often without really understanding that those data sets are being used to train an artificial intelligence. And one of DeepMind's recent projects, here's the data set from that, is to learn how to recognize human activity. So we're familiar with facial recognition, which is what's used to recognize a person. But kinetics, what this study looked at, was how to recognize human motion. So that this would be throwing a football, and this would be shooting a gun, and this would be dancing. They used it to study 250,000 videos that were uploaded to YouTube. So it learned to recognize things like eating cake or playing golf. But this is where it gets problematic. I downloaded this data set, which to their credit is freely available, and looked at the entry for person carrying baby. And as I looked at the entries, I saw a problem. The videos of carrying baby are only people that are women. So I put in many years of carrying babies, but what bothers me about this isn't because I want credit for that. It's because those videos are a data set that's training a machine to think that the only people who carry babies are women. And just like I didn't know that Google was storing all those recordings of Rowan, and these moms probably didn't know that they were being used as a data point to teach a machine, we just don't know in the future what this algorithm is going to be used for, what DeepMind will do next. Just like none of us knew that our likes on Facebook would teach an algorithm how to persuade people to vote for Brexit. And these algorithms are increasingly influencing the public sphere. So sort of piling on to Megan's examples here, but this is a study by ProPublica in the US that looked at algorithms being used in the justice system to do things like predict whether somebody is going to recommit a crime, to reoffend, which can shape things like parole and bail. So in this case, they looked at two people who had both committed petty crime. And the system rated as a high risk a black defendant on the right, while assessed a white defendant as a low risk. Meanwhile, the white defendant had much stronger prior offenses, as you can see, armed robbery, while the black defendant had minor offenses such as juvenile misdemeanors. And in fact, the system was wrong. It turned out that the white defendant went on to recommit a very serious crime while the black defendant did not. So the data that trained this algorithm is from a justice system that disproportionately incarcerates black people. This system isn't predicting the future, it's reinforcing some of the terrible patterns of our past. Even though we live in the future, it's really hard to predict the future. So that's what we have to think about. So the answer to that question, no, sorry kids, no Alexa, no Facebook accounts, and we're really stingy with the photos. So maybe in the future they'll be able to apply for a Facebook account. So thanks Silicon Valley, another reason to be terrified of them becoming teenagers.
I hated to cut you off. That was a fantastic film, and I think you're a wonderful parent. You know, what do I know? But that seemed I was inspired. I was like, I want to live in that house. So, you know, this idea of, you know, how our data is being collected and how it's being used in ways that we don't necessarily know is, you know, it brings up this issue of informed consent. Yes. And right now, it currently, you know, takes this form of things that I don't read, and a lot of people don't read. And so, you know, do you have any thoughts on ways that we can, you know, talking about translation, that was a brilliant translation of how you make data relevant to people's lives and insert certain ideas into their heads. But do you have any ideas of user-friendly tools that could be created for better consent?
Yeah, and I think a lot of times we look at, you know, what we can do as individuals and consumers, but, you know, lately at Mozilla we've really tried to flip that script. And it's, you know, when we thought about car accidents and how to present those, we didn't ask people to install their own seatbelts. So we sort of think of it in the same way, that it's time for the manufacturers to build these systems into the products that they make. And we really think about that in terms of, as you said, consent. And so we funded a really interesting project with the Allied Media Project in Detroit that looked at a report called Building Consentful Tech, which you can Google and find. And it really followed Planned Parenthood's FRIES model for evaluating sexual encounters. So FRIES stands for, is it freely given? Is it reversible? So just because you give consent at one point, you might not give consent for other uses of your data. Is it informed? Do you understand the full use of how your data is being used? Is it enthusiastic? So, you know, if you have to make an account to get Wi-Fi, that is not enthusiastic. And is it specific? So is it specific to that use? So we really think that, you know, the makers of technology, so whether you're engineers or funding projects, we really need to think about, you know, whether the technologies that we build and the platforms that we enter are consentful ones.
Great. And fries are delicious.
And so fries are delicious.
That's also...
and it's really easy to remember.
Okay, so now I want to make sure there's time. I know we ran out last time for questions from the audience. Okay, right over here. Yes.
Hi, I'm Alyssa with the Skoll Foundation, and this is a topic that I've come across a lot just in my general reading, and I'm just wondering, what are kind of like the recourses I, as like a lay person, I would say, has in order to like tell the companies that are using this data, like that I am really frustrated that their data is biased, for like with that example of only women carrying babies.
Yeah, and I think that there is an element that you're seeing right now of, you know, voting with your dollars or with your feet, and I think that is something that we're starting to see, and that's something we're really excited about at Mozilla, that there's beginning to be an ecosystem around much more healthy platforms and partners. So I think that there is an aspect that we need to start thinking about the internet as an ecosystem that we are a part of and that we can support. So, you know, choosing technology that is respectful of you, I think, is a really powerful way to do that, and there are beginning to be more and more examples of that. So I think, you know, joining some of those groups that might be a little bit uncomfortable, might be a little bit, they're not quite as cool yet as Facebook, and maybe all your friends aren't on them, but it's got to start somewhere. So I think starting to, you know, it's almost like food. You know, you have to kind of, sometimes you got to go to the farmer's market, sometimes you got to like pay a little bit more, and I think those are some steps that we kind of need to take as individuals.
Great. Thank you for that. So, we have the 3 minutes left in the overall session, and this was a disparate panel with a lot of different perspectives and ideas. So I wanted to just bring everybody back up to stage to give a lightning answer to a question. So if you could all come, and plus you can all see them again, because Ramesh feels like a long time ago at this point, and he was wonderful, and so we need to see him again. And Mbwana, get off your phone, get up here. So bossy, I'm so bossy.
Well done.
I'm not bossy, I'm the boss. Somebody said that.
Do you have socks? Because those socks exist.
Those socks exist? Yeah. Oh, okay, well I need those socks, apparently. So, we've been talking a lot about the dark side of data, but also, of course, the light side. And we know that, these types of data technologies are here to stay. They're in business, they're in politics, they're in society. And so, and my perspective is that we have a window of opportunity right now to address some of these things that each of you have brought up in different ways. And so from your vantage point, each of you come at this from a very different perspective. What is the single most important step that you can take to advance the cause of digital data for social good? Go. 10 seconds.
On that side.
For me, and this is what I was trying to get at toward the end of my few minutes speaking, is not just the inclusion, but the actual revisiting of the underlying models by which we collect and structure and calculate upon data in ways that are more open, to diverse stakeholders, right? So, in relation to your talk, am I pronouncing your name? Mbwana? Yeah, great. It's not merely the democratization of coding in Africa, it's also the underlying models by which those systems are built. That's what I was trying to get at when I was using the word ontology, right? So it's not just importing existing models from the West and training them with African data. It's also the underlying models of learning themselves. So this is central for me around this question of democratizing governance around data and learning and technology itself. So that's the big thing I'm really passionate about. Yeah.
Doug?
It's not what algorithms can do for you, it's what the person needs. And so when you're designing whatever the solution, have the people in the room who are going to be impacted by what you're working on so that you can get feedback real time on what you're building and is it going to help the human being.
Absolutely.
Great. Yeah. Megan?
Infrastructure. And this is going to sound self-serving. Jake Courey made this point this morning, so maybe if I give him credit, it's less self-serving. That there's so much work to be done right now. I mean, all of us could give so many examples of data that needs to be collected, data that needs to be analyzed differently, biased data, and there's a lot of excitement of data scientists out there who want to work on those problems, and there's not a lot of resources to actually enable that work. There's a lot of night and weekend volunteer gigs, and that's awesome. That's a great way to start, but these problems are complex, and they need a full-time commitment. So we need an infrastructure to do the work.
Agreed.
I guess be stingy. Be just as careful with your digital body as you would be with your real body.
Fries.
Fries. Because it's attached to you, and it lives forever, and you only have one.
Now I'm terrified. Okay, Mbwana.
So I go back to, you had a really nice slide on the sort of the life cycle of data, the data life cycle. And I think in Africa and many emerging markets probably you have just the beginning of the collection phase. So I just remembered that we have a portfolio company called Smile Identity that's actually, it reminds me because of the slide you had about this sort of AI being able to detect faces. And so this company is building identity. Now I mentioned how identity is a barrier to scale for some of these data companies outside of Kenya where they have a national ID. Well, there's a company that's addressing that in Tanzania and other countries where they're training AI tools to identify African faces because that's never been done before.
Right.
And this will be used as identity. So I think on the collection side, there's an opportunity to actually get ahead of it and start to kind of, but also inform government. I'm really now becoming very concerned that some of these amazing companies, both social good as well as just pure capitalistic, in Africa, in fintech lending, et cetera, are going to hit walls because governments are starting to quickly understand that data is the new oil, and they're starting to put regulations very, very fast, like Tanzania and others. I know Nigeria's working on it. So I think informing, educating government, and also allowing individuals to really handle their own data, because that's not really something Africans even expect. There are no privacy laws in many countries.
Right. Well, these are very modest calls to action. I think everybody in this room and watching online can take them on. So thank you all to the audience here. Thank you to our panelists. Have a great conference.